In a desperate bid to save his daughter, Carlos makes a choice that leads him to a chilling game of survival in the shadows of an eerie forest. What awaits him beyond the darkness? Watch the gripping story unfold. Give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have made the same decision? Carlos, an African-American man in his late 30s, had long grown accustomed to the struggles of life. Each day was a relentless grind of dual jobs and constant worry about his 8-year-old daughter, Layla, who was gravely ill with a heart condition. Her only chance of survival was an expensive heart transplant operation, and Carlos, scraping by as a janitor during the day and a warehouse loader at night, was nowhere near affording it. He barely saw Layla anymore, and the guilt of his absence gnawed at him constantly. One cold evening, after a grueling double shift, Carlos sat down on a park bench to catch his breath. The winter air was sharp, and his hands trembled as he rubbed them together for warmth. The park was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. His thoughts, as always, circled back to Layla and the ever-mounting medical bills he could not pay. Out of the silence, a tall figure emerged, stepping confidently onto the dimly lit path. The man was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes glinting faintly in the weak glow of a nearby street lamp. A dark hat obscured part of his face, but his voice was unmistakably commanding as he greeted Carlos. "Good evening," the man said, his tone smooth yet chilling. "You seem like someone in need of money." Carlos froze, his instincts tingling with unease, but the man's words struck a nerve. He nodded hesitantly, his voice failing him. The man opened a sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, holding it between two fingers as if it were nothing. "I have a proposition for you," he continued. "We'll play a simple game. Rock, paper, scissors. If you win, this is yours. If I win, I'll slap you across the face. Do we have a deal?" Carlos stared at the money. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it could at least cover some of Layla's medication. The terms were strange, even humiliating, but desperation had long since eroded his pride. "All right," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The first round was over in an instant. Carlos hesitated, and the man's paper covered his rock. Before Carlos could react, a sharp slap stung his cheek, the force sending a wave of humiliation coursing through him. The man smirked, unfazed, and gestured for another round. Carlos lost again, and again. Each defeat was punctuated by a resounding slap, the man's strikes methodical and unrelenting. Carlos's face burned, both from the pain and the shame. Yet he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Each round felt like a new opportunity, a slim chance to win and ease his burden, if only slightly. After 20 grueling attempts, Carlos finally won a round. The man handed him a crisp $100 bill without a hint of emotion. "Well done," he said flatly. "Shall we continue?" Carlos hesitated, his face throbbing from the repeated blows, but the lure of more money outweighed his battered pride. He nodded, and the game resumed. The hours dragged on, the park growing colder and darker. Carlos's swollen face was now a patchwork of bruises, his dignity in tatters. Yet he pressed on, driven by sheer determination and the image of Layla in her hospital bed. By dawn, Carlos had won $10,000. He clutched the wad of bills in his trembling hands, his mind reeling from the surreal experience. The man in the suit regarded him with an inscrutable expression and pulled a sleek business card from his pocket. "If you want to earn more," he said, handing Carlos the card, "come to this address. We have a well-paying job for someone like you." Carlos examined the card. The address was unfamiliar, and there was no name or company listed, only an enigmatic logo. The whole situation felt wrong, deeply wrong, but Carlos's desperation was stronger than his instincts. As the man disappeared into the distance, Carlos slumped back onto the bench, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. The next morning, as Carlos stood in his cramped apartment, staring at the card, doubts gnawed at him. The money he had won wasn't enough to cover Layla's surgery. The address on the card promised something more, but at what cost? His thoughts were interrupted by Layla's faint voice calling him from her room, her frailty slicing through his hesitation. Clutching the card tightly, Carlos made his decision. The morning sun filtered through the grimy window of Carlos's small apartment, casting faint rays across the cluttered room. He sat at the wobbly kitchen table, staring at the card the mysterious man had given him the night before. The address was printed in stark black ink beneath a strange logo, a symbol he didn't recognize. There was no company name, no phone number, nothing to suggest legitimacy. Every fiber of his being told him this was a bad idea, that it was too risky, too dangerous. But when he thought of Layla lying in her hospital bed, frail and struggling for each breath, he couldn't shake the possibility that this might be his only chance to save her. Carlos spent most of the morning battling his own thoughts. The $10,000 he had won was nowhere near enough to cover the cost of the surgery. The hospital bills were already piling up, and time was running out. His daughter's life was slipping through his fingers, and all he had was this card, this glimmer of hope wrapped in a veil of uncertainty. As much as he wanted to turn away, to burn the card and forget the strange man and his proposition, he knew he couldn't. Not when Layla's future depended on him. By midday, Carlos had made up his mind. He packed a small bag with essentials and left his apartment, the card tucked securely in his pocket. The address led to a remote location far outside the city, a place Carlos had never heard of. It wasn't on any map he could find online, and his phone's GPS struggled to pinpoint it. He flagged down a taxi and showed the driver the address. The older man frowned as he read it, his brow furrowing in a mix of confusion and concern. "This place," the driver said slowly, handing the card back. "I've heard of it. Strange things happen there. People go, but they don't come back. Are you sure about this?" Carlos hesitated but nodded. "I don't have a choice," he replied, his voice firm despite the knot of unease tightening in his chest. The ride was long and quiet, the city's familiar landscape giving way to rural roads and dense forests. As they approached the general area of the address, the driver grew visibly tense, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. The road narrowed until it became little more than a dirt path winding through towering trees. Eventually, the car came to a stop. "This is as far as I go," the driver said, his tone final. "The rest of the way, you'll have to walk." Carlos stepped out of the car, his bag slung over his shoulder. He turned to thank the driver, but the man had already turned the car around and was speeding away, leaving him alone in the middle of the wilderness. The forest was dense, the towering trees blotting out much of the sunlight. The air was heavy, filled with the faint rustle of unseen animals and the occasional creak of swaying branches. The path ahead was faint, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. As Carlos trudged deeper into the forest, unease settled over him like a thick fog. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the trees themselves were watching him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He kept checking the card, comparing it to the directions he had managed to find online before leaving. The journey felt endless, the path winding through the forest in a labyrinthine maze. After what felt like hours, Carlos finally emerged into a clearing. Before him lay a village unlike anything he had ever seen. The buildings were old and decrepit, their wooden frames sagging with age. Moss and vines crept up the walls, giving the place an air of abandonment. And yet there were signs of life. Dim lights flickering in some windows, faint movements in the shadows. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. As he neared the center of the village, a group of figures emerged from one of the buildings. They were dressed in pink jumpsuits, their faces obscured by masks bearing simple geometric shapes: circles, triangles, squares. They moved in unison, their silence adding to the unnerving atmosphere. One of them gestured for Carlos to stop. The figure extended a gloved hand, palm up. Carlos hesitated before realizing they were asking for his phone. Reluctantly, he handed it over, watching as the figure pocketed it without a word. Another handed him a folded green uniform, its back marked with a large number he couldn't yet make out. The mask wearer gestured for him to change, pointing to a nearby shed. Carlos entered the shed, its wooden walls creaking ominously as he closed the door. He unfolded the uniform and put it on, his apprehension growing with each passing moment. When he stepped back outside, the figures were waiting for him, their silent stares, or what he imagined were stares, fixated on him. They motioned for him to follow. They led him to a large building in the heart of the village. Inside, Carlos was met with a chilling sight. Dozens of people were gathered in the dimly lit hall, all wearing the same green uniforms as him. Their faces were etched with fear, their voices hushed as they whispered among themselves. Carlos scanned the crowd, his unease deepening. He didn't recognize anyone, but the terror in their eyes mirrored his own. As he took a seat near the back, the door slammed shut behind him, and the room fell silent. The air was thick with tension, every breath feeling like a weight pressing down on his chest. Carlos clenched his fists, his mind racing. Whatever he had stepped into, it was far worse than he had imagined. Carlos sat stiffly among the 50 or so people gathered in the large, dimly lit hall. The murmurs of nervous conversation filled the air, creating an oppressive atmosphere that pressed down on everyone present. The room itself was cold and bare, with concrete walls and a single overhead light casting long shadows that danced unnervingly across the faces of those around him. The green uniforms they all wore seemed to erase individuality, reducing everyone to numbers printed in stark black on their backs. Carlos could feel his own number pressing against his skin, an unwelcome brand marking him as one of the many. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room. Some of the others were crying softly, their fear palpable. A few sat with their heads bowed as if in silent prayer. Others stared blankly at the ground, their expressions hollow. Carlos could feel the weight of the collective dread, and it only deepened his own unease. He tried to push back the panic rising in his chest, focusing instead on observing his surroundings. The walls were plain and unadorned, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from behind them, a low, steady hum that set his teeth on edge. Suddenly, the room fell silent. The heavy metal door at the front of the hall creaked open, and all eyes turned toward it. A figure stepped through, dressed in a long black robe and wearing a mask that covered their entire face. The mask was featureless, except for two dark slits where the eyes should have been. The person exuded an air of authority, their presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Behind them, several others in the now familiar pink jumpsuits and geometric masks followed, their movements precise and synchronized. The robed figure walked to the center of the room and stopped. They stood still for a moment, surveying the crowd as if weighing each individual. Carlos felt their gaze linger on him, and a shiver ran down his spine. Finally, the figure spoke, their voice distorted by some kind of device, making it deep and mechanical. "Welcome," they began, their tone cold and emotionless. "You have all been chosen to participate in a tradition that has been carried out for generations. This is an honor bestowed upon you, though you may not yet see it that way." Carlos's stomach twisted as the words sank in. There was nothing honorable about this. Whatever was happening, it was sinister, and he could feel the danger lurking just beneath the surface. "Our ancestors," the figure continued, "believed in the purity of the hunt. They understood that life is a test of strength, of will, of survival. You, gathered here today, are the latest participants in this sacred ritual. You will prove your worth, or you will perish." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Carlos could hear the man beside him whispering frantically to himself, his words an incoherent jumble of fear and denial. Carlos clenched his fists, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate scare tactic, a sick joke. But the robed figure's next words shattered any lingering hope he had. "You are here because you are expendable," they said, their voice chillingly matter-of-fact. "You are the weak, the unworthy, the undeserving. And so, you will serve your purpose in this ritual. The strong will prevail, and the rest will be cleansed from this world." Carlos's breath caught in his throat. The figure's words were laced with a venomous disdain, their intent clear. This wasn't just about survival. It was about erasure, about dehumanization. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. These people didn't see him or anyone else in this room as human beings. They were prey, nothing more. The figure raised a gloved hand, and one of the pink-suited individuals stepped forward, holding a tablet. They began to read off names and numbers, their voice monotone and detached. As each name was called, the corresponding individual was motioned to stand and step forward. Carlos watched as, one by one, the people around him were led to another part of the hall. Some went willingly, their faces pale with resignation. Others resisted, their protests silenced by the armed guards who flanked them. When Carlos's name and number were finally called, he forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead, but he willed them to move. As he walked toward the front of the room, he could feel the eyes of the others on him, their fear mirrored in his own. The guard gestured for him to follow, and he was led through a side door into a narrow hallway. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with old, rusted pipes that creaked as they cooled. The faint hum he had heard earlier grew louder, and he realized it was coming from somewhere deeper within the building. The guards said nothing as they escorted him, their silence only heightening his anxiety. Finally, they reached another door, this one marked with a single word painted in bold red letters, "Preparation." The door swung open, and Carlos was pushed inside. The room was stark and clinical, a sharp contrast to the decayed exterior of the village. Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating rows of lockers and benches. More guards stood at attention along the walls, their expressions hidden behind their masks. Carlos was handed a small bag containing a bottle of water and a simple energy bar. The gesture was almost laughable in its normalcy given the circumstances. "You have 5 minutes to prepare," one of the guards said, their voice muffled. "Then you will return to the hall." Carlos nodded numbly, his mind spinning. Prepare for what? The question hung heavily in the air, unspoken but understood. He sat down on one of the benches, opening the bag and sipping the water. His hands trembled as he tried to collect his thoughts, but the reality of his situation was overwhelming. He was trapped in a nightmare with no clear way out. When the 5 minutes were up, the guards returned and escorted him back to the main hall. The atmosphere was even heavier now, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Carlos returned to his seat, his heart pounding as he waited for whatever was coming next. The robed figure stood at the front of the room once more, their hands clasped in front of them. "The time has come," they announced, their voice echoing ominously. "You will face the trial ahead, and the hunt will begin. May the strongest survive." Carlos's stomach churned as the meaning of those words became clear. This wasn't just a game or a test, it was a fight for his life. Carlos sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the faint murmurs around him. The robed figure at the front of the hall stood still, their ominous presence commanding the room's attention. Behind the figure, the guards in pink jumpsuits remained motionless, their weapons casually slung over their shoulders, but clearly ready to be used. The air was suffocating, thick with fear and despair. "You are here to participate in the great hunt," the figure announced, their mechanical voice slicing through the tense silence. "This is no ordinary hunt, and you are no ordinary prey. This is a tradition born of strength, purity, and the natural order. You, the unworthy, will serve as the ultimate test for those who are destined to rule." Carlos clenched his fist tightly, his nails digging into his palms. He forced himself to keep a calm expression, but inside, his thoughts raced. This was madness, pure and simple. These people, this cult, weren't just deranged, they were monsters. Their words dripped with hatred, their entire philosophy built on the dehumanization of people like him. The room around him felt like a trap closing in. The figure continued, their voice growing colder with each sentence. "You are here because you are expendable. Your existence is a blemish, a reminder of the mistakes of the past. But tonight, you have been given a chance to prove your worth. Those who survive will have earned their place. Those who fall will be cleansed." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Some of the captives began to sob openly, while others whispered desperate prayers. Carlos looked around, his eyes meeting those of the other participants. The shared terror in their faces only deepened his resolve. He wasn't going to let these people win, not without a fight. The figure raised their hand, silencing the room. "You may think this is cruel, but cruelty is necessary. It is the foundation of strength, the bedrock of power. This is your trial, and you should feel honored to partake in it." One of the guards stepped forward, holding a large tablet. They began reading out names and numbers, their voice flat and emotionless. As each name was called, the corresponding individual was ordered to stand and move to the center of the room. Some complied immediately, their movements robotic with fear. Others resisted, screaming and pleading, but their protests were met with swift and brutal force from the guards. When Carlos's name and number were called, he forced himself to his feet. His legs felt heavy, as though weighed down by the gravity of the moment. He moved to the center of the room, joining the growing group of captives. The guards surrounded them, herding them toward a large metal door at the back of the hall. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor that stretched into shadow. The captives were pushed through, their protests and cries echoing against the cold, concrete walls. The corridor was lit sporadically by flickering bulbs, the dim light casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move. Carlos's mind raced as he walked. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something. But the guards' weapons were a constant reminder of the futility of resistance. He had to bide his time, wait for the right moment. He glanced at the others around him, noting the varying expressions of fear, anger, and resignation. If he was going to survive, he needed allies. He needed a plan. The corridor opened into a large outdoor area at the edge of the village. A thick forest loomed ahead, its dark, tangled branches creating a natural wall that seemed impenetrable. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decay. The captives were lined up in rows, their green uniforms standing out starkly against the dim surroundings. The robed figure appeared again, stepping onto a raised platform at the edge of the clearing. Their black mask glinted in the faint light as they addressed the group. "The rules are simple," they said. "You will be given a 5-minute head start to run. After that, the hunt begins. The forest is vast, but it is not without its dangers. Choose your path wisely. Those who attempt to leave the designated area will be eliminated immediately." Carlos's stomach churned as the implications of those words sank in. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a carefully orchestrated slaughter. The forest would be their prison, its boundaries enforced by armed guards and whatever traps these people had set. He glanced at the trees, their dark silhouettes both a refuge and a threat. The figure continued, their voice dripping with contempt. "To those who survive, there will be a reward, a chance to reclaim your life and more. But let me be clear, survival is not guaranteed. Many have come before you, and few have left. This is your trial. This is your fate." The guards stepped forward, their weapons raised, as if daring anyone to act out of turn. Carlos's muscles tensed as he assessed the situation. The odds were stacked against them, but he refused to give up. He thought of Layla, her small hand gripping his, her weak smile as she tried to hide her pain. He couldn't let her down. He had to survive. For her. The robed figure raised a hand, signaling the start of the countdown. 5 minutes, they announced. Make the most of them. The clearing erupted into chaos. Some captives broke into a sprint immediately, darting into the forest with wild desperation. Others hesitated, their fear rooting them in place. Carlos took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the trees for a potential path. He couldn't afford to panic. He needed to stay focused, to think clearly. The guards moved closer, their presence a constant reminder of the danger. Carlos clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. This was it. His life depended on what he did in the next few minutes. He took one last look at the clearing, committing every detail to memory before stepping toward the forest. The robed figure's voice rang out one final time, cold and unyielding. "The hunt begins now. Run." The clearing erupted into chaos the moment the signal was given. The loud crack of a gunshot echoed through the air, sharp and jarring against the stillness of the night. The captives burst into motion, a wave of bodies surging toward the forest's edge with frantic desperation. Carlos's heart pounded in his chest as he joined the rush, his feet pounding against the cold, hard ground. The forest loomed ahead, dark and impenetrable, a labyrinth of twisted trees and undergrowth that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. Carlos forced himself to focus, his mind racing as he tried to process his surroundings. The roar of panicked cries filled his ears, drowning out the rhythmic thud of his footsteps. Some of the captives ran blindly, their movements erratic as they stumbled and tripped over unseen roots. Others clung together in small groups, their whispered plans of escape barely audible over the din. Carlos knew he had no time to waste. Every second was a chance to put as much distance as possible between himself and the armed hunters who would soon follow. The forest swallowed him whole, its dense canopy blotting out the moonlight and plunging the path ahead into near total darkness. Branches scraped against his arms and legs, their jagged edges biting into his skin as he pushed forward. The ground beneath him was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and tangled roots that threatened to trip him with every step. He stumbled once, catching himself on a nearby tree trunk as he gasped for breath. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying vegetation. Carlos glanced back, his chest tightening at the sight of flickering flashlights in the distance. The hunters were already moving, their beams cutting through the trees like searchlights in the dark. He couldn't see them clearly, but the faint metallic glint of their weapons was unmistakable. Panic surged through him, urging him to move faster. He pushed off the tree and ran, his legs burning with the effort as he navigated the treacherous terrain. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of chaos began to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed against his ears like a heavy weight. He could no longer hear the screams of the other captives, nor the barked orders of the hunters. The silence was unnerving, its emptiness amplifying the pounding of his heart and the ragged gasps of his breath. Carlos slowed his pace, his instincts telling him to stay quiet. He crouched behind a large tree, his back pressed against its rough bark as he strained to listen for any signs of movement. The forest was alive with its own rhythm, a symphony of rustling leaves and distant animal calls that seemed to mock the terror unfolding within its depths. Carlos's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of danger. He could feel the cold sweat on his skin, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he tried to steady his breathing. His thoughts raced back to Layla, her fragile body lying in that hospital bed. He couldn't die here. He couldn't leave her alone in this world. A sudden crack of a branch nearby sent a jolt of fear through him. He pressed himself tighter against the tree, his muscles tensing as he scanned the darkness. A shadow moved between the trees, its outline indistinct but unmistakably human. Carlos held his breath, his mind scrambling for options. He had no weapons, no tools, nothing but his wits and the sheer will to survive. The shadow drew closer, its footsteps deliberate and measured. Carlos gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain still despite the primal urge to run. The figure stopped a few feet away, its silhouette partially obscured by the dense foliage. Carlos could make out the faint glint of a weapon in its hand, the barrel pointed downward as the hunter scanned the area. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on as Carlos waited for the figure to move. Finally, the hunter turned and walked away, their flashlight beam slicing through the trees as they disappeared into the distance. Carlos exhaled shakily, his body trembling from the strain of holding himself still. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. He needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and his pursuers. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate and quiet as he crept deeper into the forest. Each step was a calculated risk, his senses on high alert for any signs of danger. The forest seemed to close in around him, its oppressive darkness and tangled undergrowth creating a maze that threatened to swallow him whole. Carlos's thoughts turned to the others. Were they still running? Had any of them been caught? The questions lingered in his mind, unanswered and haunting. Carlos stumbled upon a small clearing, its edges marked by a ring of ancient trees that towered overhead. He paused, his chest heaving as he surveyed the area. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but he couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. He moved to the center of the clearing, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The faint glow of the moon filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground that shifted with the breeze. A faint noise reached his ears, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Carlos froze, his breath catching in his throat as he strained to locate the source. The growl came again, closer this time, and he realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't human. His heart raced as he backed away, his eyes darting around the clearing. He had no idea what kind of predators lurked in these woods, but the sound alone was enough to send him running. Before he could move, a blur of motion shot out from the shadows. Carlos barely had time to react as a large, shadowy figure lunged toward him, its jaws snapping inches from his face. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing as he tried to keep his balance. The creature, some kind of wolf or wild dog, circled him, its glowing eyes locked onto his every movement. Carlos's survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, wielding it like a makeshift weapon as the creature lunged again. He swung the branch with all his strength, the impact sending the animal sprawling back with a yelp. Taking the opportunity, Carlos turned and sprinted into the forest, his breath ragged as he pushed himself to keep going. The sounds of the creature's pursuit faded into the distance, replaced once again by the oppressive silence of the woods. Carlos didn't stop running until his legs gave out, and he collapsed against a tree, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His hands trembled as he clutched the branch, his only means of defense. The forest seemed endless, its shadows stretching on forever. But Carlos knew he couldn't give up. Layla needed him, and he would do whatever it took to make it back to her. Carlos crouched behind a cluster of thick bushes, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. His legs burned from running, his muscles screaming for rest, but he couldn't stop. The forest around him was alive with the distant sounds of footsteps, shouts, and the occasional crack of gunfire. The hunters were closing in, their relentless pursuit a stark reminder that his survival hung by the thinnest thread. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his trembling hands clutching the branch he'd grabbed earlier. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon he had. The forest was eerily quiet aside from the distant chaos. The canopy above was so dense that it blotted out most of the moonlight, leaving only faint patches of silver on the forest floor. Shadows loomed everywhere, their shapes shifting with the faint breeze, creating an oppressive sense of unease. Carlos's senses were on high alert, every crackle of leaves and snap of a twig sending his heart racing. He knew the hunters weren't far behind, but he had no idea how much of a lead he still had, or if it was enough. His thoughts turned to Layla, her small, fragile body lying in that hospital bed. The image of her pale face, her soft voice calling him Daddy, was both his strength and his weakness. He couldn't fail her. She was his reason to keep moving, to keep fighting, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus. He had to stay alive, not just for himself, but for her. The faint rustling of leaves to his left snapped him out of his thoughts. Carlos froze, his grip tightening on the branch as he peered through the foliage. A flashlight beam swept across the forest floor, illuminating the gnarled roots and thick underbrush. He held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched the light draw closer. A shadow moved behind it, the distinct outline of a hunter in a pink jumpsuit, their weapon slung across their chest. Carlos's mind raced. He couldn't run. The noise would give him away instantly. He couldn't fight either, not against someone armed and trained. His only option was to stay hidden and hope they passed by. He pressed himself lower to the ground, his body trembling as he fought to remain still. The flashlight beam moved closer, its bright light cutting through the darkness like a knife. The hunters stopped just a few feet away, their boots crunching softly against the leaves. Carlos could hear his own heartbeat, loud and deafening in the silence. The hunters' breathing was steady, unhurried, as if they were savoring the chase. They scanned the area with their flashlight, their movements deliberate and methodical. Carlos's muscles ached from the tension, his lungs screaming for air as he held his breath. The hunter lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally moving on, their light disappearing into the distance. Carlos exhaled shakily, his body sagging with relief. He stayed still for a moment longer, waiting until he was sure the hunter was gone before rising to his feet. He moved cautiously, each step deliberate and silent as he navigated the dense underbrush. The forest seemed endless, its labyrinthine paths winding in every direction. He had no sense of where he was or where he was going, only that he needed to keep moving. As he crept deeper into the woods, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, replaced by the eerie stillness of the forest. The quiet was unnerving, every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves setting his nerves on edge. He knew the hunters wouldn't stop until they found him. They were methodical, relentless, their cruelty evident in every move they made. Carlos felt like an animal being hunted, his humanity stripped away by the twisted rules of this sick game. He stumbled upon a small stream, its clear water reflecting the faint light filtering through the canopy. Carlos knelt by the bank, cupping his hands to drink. The cold water soothed his parched throat, providing a brief moment of respite. He splashed some on his face, the shock of the cold helping to clear his mind. As he sat back, his eyes scanned the area. The stream could serve as a natural path, but it was also dangerous. It was too open, too exposed, and the hunters could easily track him along its banks. A faint noise in the distance caught his attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. Carlos tensed, his instincts screaming at him to move. He rose to his feet, his eyes darting around for a safe path. The forest offered little in the way of cover, its dense undergrowth both a blessing and a curse. He chose a direction at random, following the stream's curve as he moved deeper into the woods. The noise grew louder, the distinct sound of footsteps breaking through the silence. Carlos's pulse quickened as he realized the hunters were closing in again. He pushed himself to move faster, his legs burning with the effort. The stream twisted and turned, its path winding through the forest like a serpent. Carlos kept to its edge, using the sound of the water to mask his movements. He glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of flickering flashlight beams in the distance. The terrain grew steeper, the forest floor sloping upward as the stream narrowed into a trickle. Carlos climbed, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought against the incline. The trees grew sparser, their branches thinner and less tangled. He could see the sky now, its dark expanse dotted with stars. The openness was both a relief and a risk. He was more visible, but he also had a better view of his surroundings. Reaching the top of the slope, Carlos paused to catch his breath. He crouched behind a fallen tree, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. The forest stretched out before him, a sea of shadows and faint moonlight. He could hear the hunters below, their voices carrying through the still night air. They were close, but not close enough to spot him. Carlos's mind raced as he considered his options. He needed to find a way to lose them for good, to create enough distance to disappear. He noticed a narrow ravine to his right, its steep walls lined with jagged rocks and dense vegetation. It was risky, but it might be his best chance. Carlos moved carefully, his steps deliberate as he descended into the ravine. The air grew cooler, the sound of the forest muffled by the rocky walls. He pressed on, his determination fueled by the thought of Layla. He couldn't give up. He wouldn't. The faint sound of voices faded into the distance, replaced by the steady rush of water echoing through the ravine. Carlos allowed himself a brief moment of relief, his body sagging against the cold, damp rock. He wasn't safe yet, but he had bought himself some time. He clung to that thought as he prepared to move again, his resolve stronger than ever. The clearing was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the captives lined up near the edge of the forest. The air felt heavy, as though the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on everyone. Carlos stood among them, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain those around him could hear it. The robed figure stood on the raised platform, their black mask gleaming faintly in the dim moonlight. Behind them, the guards in pink jumpsuits stood at attention, their weapons held casually but with an air of readiness that left no doubt about their intent. Carlos glanced to his left and right, taking in the faces of the people around him. Most were frozen in terror, their eyes darting between the forest and the guards, as if calculating their chances of survival. Some were quietly crying, their shoulders shaken as they tried to stifle their sobs. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions hollow and resigned. Carlos forced himself to focus. He had no room for fear now. Fear would slow him down, make him hesitate. He couldn't afford that. Not if he wanted to live. The robed figure raised their hand, commanding silence. The faint murmurs and sobs ceased immediately, replaced by a tense, suffocating stillness. "The time has come," the figure announced, their voice carrying over the clearing with chilling authority. "You have 5 minutes to run. Use this time wisely, for it may be the last you have. When the signal is given, the hunt will begin. There will be no mercy, no leniency. Only the strongest will survive." Carlos's stomach churned as the words settled over the group. The cold detachment in the figure's tone made it clear that this was no empty threat. This was a game to them, a sick, twisted tradition cloaked in ritual and cruelty. The hunters didn't see them as people. To them, they were prey, nothing more. The guards began moving forward, corralling the captives into a tighter line. Carlos could feel the tension radiating from those around him, the fear and desperation palpable. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. The forest was vast, its dark expanse stretching endlessly into the night. It offered some cover, but it was also unknown, filled with dangers both natural and man-made. He needed a plan, something to give him even the slightest edge. The robed figure raised a flare gun into the air. "Run," they said, their voice sharp and final. "Make it count." The clearing exploded into chaos. People screamed and pushed, shoving their way toward the forest with frantic desperation. Carlos bolted forward, his legs propelling him across the uneven ground as fast as they could carry him. The sounds of panic and fear filled his ears, cries for help, the thud of bodies hitting the ground as people tripped or were pushed aside. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The forest was his only hope, and every second he wasted was a second closer to death. The moment he crossed the tree line, the world changed. The air grew cooler, the dense canopy above blotting out the moonlight and plunging the forest into near total darkness. Carlos stumbled over exposed roots and fallen branches, his arms outstretched to push aside the thick undergrowth. The noise of the others faded quickly, their frantic footsteps and panicked cries swallowed by the vastness of the forest. He kept running, his chest burning with the effort, his mind racing as he tried to orient himself. He reached a small clearing and stopped, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. His ears strained for any sound, any indication of the hunters. The forest was alive with its own noises, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, but nothing human. Yet. Carlos knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The hunters were coming, and when they did, they wouldn't stop until everyone was dead. Carlos crouched low, scanning the clearing for any signs of movement. His instincts told him to keep moving, but he needed to think. The forest was vast, yes, but it was also their trap. The hunters knew it well, likely better than anyone else. They would have planned for every possible escape route, every hiding spot. Carlos had to be smarter, faster, more resourceful. The faint sound of a gunshot echoed in the distance, sharp and jarring against the quiet. Carlos flinched, his grip tightening on a fallen branch he had picked up earlier. The game had begun. He pushed off the tree and started moving again, his steps quieter now, more deliberate. He needed to conserve his energy, to pace himself. This wasn't just a sprint. It was survival. As he moved deeper into the forest, the darkness seemed to close in around him. The trees grew thicker, their gnarled branches forming a natural maze that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Carlos paused, listening. There were faint sounds in the distance, shouts, gunfire, the snap of branches underfoot. The hunters were spreading out, their pursuit methodical and relentless. Carlos crouched behind a large tree, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. He had no weapons, no tools, nothing but his will to survive. The thought of Layla kept him moving, kept him pushing forward despite the fear and exhaustion threatening to consume him. He couldn't die here. Not like this. She needed him, and he wouldn't let her down. A sudden rustle nearby made Carlos freeze. He held his breath, his body tense as he scanned the darkness. A flashlight beam cut through the trees, its light sweeping across the forest floor. Carlos pressed himself against the tree, his heart pounding in his chest. The hunter was close, too close. He could hear their footsteps now, slow and deliberate as they moved closer. Carlos gripped the branch tightly, his mind racing. He had no choice. If they found him, it was over. He waited until the flashlight beam moved past him, then darted to the side, his movements quick and silent. The hunter didn't notice, their focus still on the area where he had been hiding. Carlos used the distraction to put more distance between them, weaving through the trees with careful precision. The forest seemed endless, its shadows stretching on forever. Carlos's legs burned with exhaustion, his lungs straining for air, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The distant sounds of the hunt were a constant reminder of what awaited him if he did. He pressed on, his determination fueled by the faint hope that he might survive, that he might see Layla again. A loud, piercing sound suddenly echoed through the forest, the blast of a horn, sharp and final. Carlos froze, his breath catching in his throat. The signal had been given. The hunt had begun. To be continued. The story has just begun, but the real danger lies ahead. What would you do in Carlos's place? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to see what happens next.